Hi, it is lesson 2, so week 2 for the month of September. Just a little bit of review for those of you who are coming in on the Zoom recording and missed the class. Last week, week 1, when we started with fairy tales, we went to France and we talked about Charles Perrault, born in the 1600s. He, like Aesop, the Greek storyteller with fables, is credited with retelling older fairy tales. Now, remember, fairy tales are like fables. They are passed down from generation to generation. And remember, Perrault was the one who added the glass slipper. That little addition, that little change, that little modification. Wow, look what that did for the story of Cinderella. He also added a second ball. Okay, so now we're going to go to the next century, and we're going to talk about a famous set of brothers from Germany. We're going to focus on the brothers Grimm. So they were born, Jacob and Wilhelm Grimm, in 1785 and 1786. They attended university together. They began to write down pre-existing stories that they already heard other people telling. Again, remember, it's folklore. In 1812, they published their first collection of 86 fairy tales titled Children's and Household Tales. It was so successful that they collected as many as they could, reaching 200. And this is what we know today as the collection of Grimm's fairy tales. Let me be clear, they did not write them. They retold them in a collection. So wonderful, right? They worked as librarians who later became professors. They were known as experts in collecting stories, especially those in the German language. So you'll see a lot of Grimm's fairy tales. It's kind of dark, sinister, and maybe not so much today with the internet, but when I was a kid, it was, kind of scary. They were born in Hanau, Germany, and today they have a fairy tale festival every year to honor them. So the one we're going to talk about today is kind of a different one. It's called The 12 Huntsmen. So in this story, there's really not great characterization like last week. Last week, Perrault did just this magnificent job of creating the character of Cinderella, and she was almost perfectly nice. And then he had the opposing characters of the stepsisters who were awful, arrogant and selfish and self-centered. And we don't have that today. We really don't have characterization developed in this story. If anything, the protagonist in this story, who's the prince, he's kind of flawed. He's not perfect. So we're going to talk about a couple of definitions. So if you scroll down to page 4 at the end of the story, the word promise, an oral or written agreement to do or not to do something. So you can sign an arbitration contract that says, I refuse to disclose anything. It's called a non-disclosure agreement. Or you can sign a contract, I vow to honor this contract. So you're going to want to use the word promise a lot. Promise, 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 promise. It's going to be hard not to. But look at the synonyms. Word of honor, your word, pledge, a vow, an assurance, an oath, a guarantee, an agreement, a covenant, we swear, a contract. So in this story, the prince is going to break a promise, not once, not twice, 3 times. And I want you to think about how it feels when mom and dad promise you something, or a friend, or a sibling, and they break that promise not once, not twice, but 3 times, and how you would feel about that person. And I'm going to guess that the bonds of trust are broken. And that's the entire message of this story. The word fickle, maybe you haven't heard that word, is changing your mind frequently. especially when it comes to your loyalties, your interests, or affection. Now, you can be fickle about food. One day mom cooks a dish and you're like, I love this, mom. And then a week or two later, same dish. And you're like, no, I don't care for it. We can be fickle about relationships. One day you like a friend, especially when it gets into relationships, girls and boys, teenagers. I really like her today. She's so cute. And then 2 days later, I like that other girl. That's fickle. So synonyms for fickle: capricious, love that word, changeable, faithless, disloyal. And that's what you're going to see in the story today. Undependable. Okay, and then the last word we're going to talk about is omniscient, having infinite awareness, understanding, and insight. And that's not a mortal quality, everyone. It's not a human quality, okay? Synonyms for omniscience: all-knowing, all-wise, all-seeing. So these are your mythical gods. These are your witches. These are your seers. These are someone that has a component. They just know things. And that's not your average person. So in the story, we're going to have a lion witch. And he's really only important in the story in the sense that he really kind of shows how the huntsman is starting to become, egocentric as the story evolves. At the beginning of the story, the king is naive. And he really doesn't have a lot of responsibility. So we're going to start with the beginning of the story, and I probably will not read the story and take 12 minutes of your class time to do that. So I do ask that students read the story because there's no way to do this assignment without doing it. But I will ask that you go to the first page of the story, and you will see there was once a king's son who was betrothed to a maiden whom he loved very much. So that's engaged. Betrothed. And when he was sitting beside her and very happy, news came that his father lay sick unto death and desired to see him once again before his end. And then we have a quote that you'll see in red. Then he said to his beloved, I must go now and leave thee. I give thee a ring as a remembrance of me. When I'm king, I will return and fetch thee. I mean, that's a promise. That's textual reference shows not only did he promise her a word, he gave her a ring. And I'm guessing he gave her the royal family heirloom ring, right? He's the prince, right? So everything looks good, right? He rode away, and when he reached his father, the latter was dangerously ill and near his death. And he said to him, Dear son, I wish to see thee once again before my end. Promise me to marry as I wish. Whoa, wait. He named a certain king's daughter who's to be his wife, not the one from the beginning of the story. Now, wait, back up. Ouch. This is tough. His father is dying. He is the king. So it's his dad, it's the king, it's a dying wish. What choice does he have but to honor the king's wishes? So he said, yes, dear father, your will shall be done. Okay, the moment he said that, he broke his vow. And what's really interesting in this story really doesn't go back to her. He just kind of forgets about her. Like, all right, I'll just honor your wishes. Okay, but I want you to think about why this happened in the first place. Not uncommon for royal families to arrange marriages. Not uncommon today in Indian Asian families to have arranged marriages. So why would they want an arranged marriage in royal families? Well, for obvious reasons. Wealthy want to marry wealthy. Royals want to marry royals. They're called blue bloods because they understand what duty and responsibility to the throne means. And they understand duty supersedes all else. And if you have something in common with someone, a lifestyle, a way of living, and I think that the relationship's probably going to work better if that happens. So that's interesting. That's kind of, if you think about when this was written in the 1800s, yeah, it was happening. Okay, so his betrothed, the first love, hears about his faithlessness and almost dies. She's shattered. He broke his vow to her. Wanting to be close to him, she asks her father to help her disguise herself and 11 other women of similar face, figure, and size. So they search the kingdom and find 11 women who look just like her. So they put on 12 huntsmen's clothing to disguise themselves, and they go to the king and ask if they can be their huntsman. Now, why would they have to disguise themselves as men? Women were not huntsmen in those days. So this is the part that kind of tripped me up a little bit, everybody. If you're so in love with somebody that you propose to them and you give them a ring, wouldn't you recognize them, disguise or not? Not to mention the fact that the 11 other women were of similar face, figure, and size. Okay, so as I pondered that question, and I've read this, over and over again, 4 different class times, I think, never said it in the story. This is an inference. This is just something I kind of picked up on. It took me 3 days to pick up on it. I think maybe he did subconsciously, and he wanted her around him. And that becomes clear at the end of the story. So he also the king had a lion witch in his service. And he tells him, those aren't huntsmen, those are women. And the king's like, no, they're not. He's like, yeah. So as with all fairy tales, there were tests. They test them. And it was really interesting. The tests for the 12 huntsmen are tests that a girl would fail. This is what a girl would do. This is what a guy would do. So stereotyping male and female roles here. And then a servant who really liked the huntsmen, favored them, showed them how to pass the test. And then when the king goes to the lion witch and says, you were wrong, they passed the test, he basically gets rid of the lion witch. Remember, he's omniscient. He knows more than the king. So we're starting to see the ego of the king. We're starting to see him, right, want it his way. And that would happen. His dad was the king. He took the throne, didn't have power, didn't have responsibility. And as you have that, maybe you get a little, egotistical about it. Okay, so we're going to fast forward to the end of the story, which is really where the promises come into play again. So all we've had throughout all that middle part is just explanation and a fun story. What we want to prove today is promises broken. So far, only one promise was broken on the king's deathbed when he says, yes, I will honor your request. And that's the first promise broken. And then we scroll to the end of the story, and then we have an event happen. It came to pass when they were out hunting, news came that the king's betrothed was approaching. When the true bride heard that, it hurt her so much that her heart was almost broken, and she fell fainting to the ground. The king thought something had happened to his dear huntsman, see my little clue there, ran up to him, wanted to help him, and drew his glove off. Then he saw the ring, which he'd given to his first bride, and when he looked into her face, he recognized her. Then his heart was so touched that he kissed her, and when she opened her eyes, he said, this is big. Thou art mine, and I am thine, and no one in the world can alter that. He just chose her. He just chose her as his bride. He just broke his trust with his father, the late king. He broke the second promise right there. Not uncommon today, right? Maybe someone decides to marry someone else. Maybe I feel stronger feelings for this other person. The last promise he breaks is really prophetic. What I mean by prophetic meaning, this is not going to be good, because there's probably a reason the king wanted him to marry this other princess from another kingdom. A lot of students in the class said, well, it would be because maybe the king wanted to form an alliance. Maybe they were feuding kingdoms, and maybe this marriage would create a union. It would ensure peace. It definitely would strengthen loyalties. Okay, so what happens here is he sends a messenger, here's the textual reference, to the other bride and entranced her to return to her own kingdom, for he had a wife already. Ouch. And he doesn't do it nicely. He doesn't like go face to face with her and say, I'm so sorry. This is what happened. He just has some lackey tell her to go back home. Okay, so what's the problem with this? She's probably traveled a long way, weeks, right? And she believes she's going to marry him. And he says something awful here. He says, a man who just found an old dish did not require a new one. And that's my least favorite part of this story. Thereupon the wedding was celebrated, and the lion was again taken into favor because, after all, he told the truth. So what is going on here is he made a colossal mistake there. I mean, first of all, he broke a promise to another king and another king's daughter from another kingdom. Huh. Oh, so that's the third promise broken. But this could have cataclysmic results, right? So a little bit selfish here at the end. So if you go to your story elements, obviously we have a prince and a first love interest, kind of the protagonists, not strong ones. The antagonist, the dying king, I mean, not really. So what do we have happening here? A prince and a princess are in love when the story begins. When the prince hears news his father's about to die, he leaves his betrothed with his ring, telling her when he's king, he will return for her. Promise. Okay, on his deathbed, his father, the king, asked the prince to marry a different bride. Having no other choice but to honor the king's last dying wish, the son, who is now king, is forced to honor his promise and marry someone he doesn't love. Okay. All right. So there's a second promise, right, to the king, but a first promise broken. The first love plots to find a way to be near the new king and disguises herself, as well as 11 others who look like her in face, figure, and size, who go to the newly crowned king's kingdom and become his huntsmen. When she approaches the new king and asks him if he needs huntsmen, he does not recognize her, but agrees to take them on in his service. So this is the part where, after reading the story over and over again, you see something different. I think he sensed her. Maybe he didn't, like fully recognize her, but for some reason he wanted her around. The lion witch can see what the king cannot and tells him he's been duped by his 12 huntsmen, who are all females. The lion attempts to discredit the girls, but they are assisted by a sympathetic servant who helps them to pass 2 tests by telling them what they must do to avoid being discovered. Now, this is a flaw in the story. There should have been 3. 3 is a literary device. But this makes the king stop believing the lion witch and favor the 12 huntsmen. So I think the only reason this is in the story is to show his evolution, to show his pridefulness, that he's starting to make decisions based on what he wants, right? Not what, his duty is, and not what his father, who's now gone, has asked him to do. One day, as the king is told his betrothed is approaching, his first love, disguised as one of his huntsmen, falls to the ground in despair. When the king takes off the huntsman's glove, he discovers the betrothed ring, looks in her face, and finally recognition. This is my first love. He wants to marry her instead. The new king sends away the other bride his father chose for him and decides to marry his first love. So we have long, long ago an imaginary kingdom. And the conflict here is really about keeping one's promise. The prince is beholden to keep the king's promise, but in doing so betrays his first love. And then the subterfuge of the 12 females serving the king and the lion witch. Okay, but you know why she's doing it, right? So what's the message here? It's important to keep one's promise. Not so simple, is it? And I think this is relevant in any generation. Remember, the Grimm's brothers wrote these in the 1800s, but these were probably hundreds of years old before that. So what I love about fables and I love about fairy tales is they really focus on humanity, our flawed nature. So it brings to light why we need to honor a promise. Because when someone, breaks a promise to us, it is hurtful. And it does, force us to go, do I trust this person? So if you go to your outline, and I'm not really concerned about the leads so much, they've not been so great. All I was doing here was really just trying to show you in royal families, it is common for a king to arrange the marriage of a prince or princess. This is to ensure loyalty to another country, stop conflicts, such as impending war, to create an alliance. Another common practice is a dying wish. This is your last chance to make an impression. And there's something about a person's dying wish that most people respect. Making a vow under duress, though, it's asking a lot. Because when someone swears to uphold another promise on someone's deathbed, they feel an immense pressure to please them or give them peace in their final moments. So here's what we're going to prove today. In the fairy tale, The 12 Huntsmen, the overall message, we're going to prove the theme, is it's important to keep one's promise, not your promise. I don't want you and one's promise. And we're going to show this with specific textual references. So if you go in the outline, I made that really, really clear. I was so nice. I actually gave you the textual references. Okay, so what you're going to want to do, and this one, you're going to have to want to weave it in. When you introduce a quote, always explain where it is in the story. So we always want to start chronologically in the beginning. So there are 3 occasions in the story where a promise is broken. When someone's feelings were hurt and the bonds of trust were, and I just realized I put the word broken, I'm going to put severed or destroyed, whatever you like, destroyed, like that. So the first time the prince made a vow and could not keep it was obviously with his first love. He gives her a ring. He says, I'll be back. The textual reference says, then he said to his beloved. So what we could do here, at the beginning of the story, and that would let the reader know where we are in the textual references. I must go now and leave thee. I give thee a ring as remembrance of me. When I'm king, I will return and fetch thee. Okay, so just something I noticed in some of the edits, so you get the benefit if you're doing this through Zoom. You don't have to use the whole quote. You can stop the quote anywhere you want, and as long as it proves your claim, you don't have to go any further. Okay, so we know he makes another promise to his father, the king, on his deathbed. Okay. But when he makes the promise to the king, he breaks the promise to his first love. So we have 2 things going on here. So the king says to his son, dear son, find that. Dear son, I wish to see thee once again before my end. Promise me to marry as I wish. And then the rest of this says, and he named a certain king's daughter who was to be wife. The son was in such trouble. Okay, none of this is necessary. Like, I wouldn't use any of that. I would just take it out. I would say, when the son replied, yes, dear father, your will shall be done, bam, he broke the promise to his first betrothed. And really in the story, her again, not really. He just went on his way, went on his kingly way, where she's all brokenhearted and disguising herself and 11 other people as huntsmen. So really, it's till the end of the story. Okay, so towards the end, I hope you're following me, of the story, the king breaks his word a second and third time. Okay, a second and third time. Okay. Okay, so we kind of can start with when the prince was the reigning king. Okay, so I'm gonna switch that out. Okay. When he discovered, pop this in here so it's easier. When he discovered the huntsman was his first love, he decided to marry her. Thou art mine, and I am thine, and no one in the world can alter that. Then right after that, he must take care of the bride who's on her way. Okay. So then he sends a messenger to the other bride and entreated her to return to her own kingdom, for he had a wife already. You don't need the rest of that. And a man who just found an old dish did not require a new one. That's not relevant. So the trick here is I'm giving you the entire quote. That doesn't mean you use the whole thing. Only enough to prove your point. Now, what do you do between all this? Well, between all this, you have to explain what's going on in the story. You can't just say, this quote proves it, this quote proves it. You've got to do some connections, some transitions. And that's the hardest part for everybody, to do this in the body paragraph. So the fairy tale, The 12 Huntsmen, serves as a reminder for children today, showing them when someone breaks their promise, they also destroy bonds of trust, which was made clear in the textual passages. So in the story, the prince who becomes king after his father's death is shown to be a flawed character. When he becomes betrothed at the beginning, he's a prince who's fallen in love and has no real responsibility. And even when his father asks him to promise to marry another, we almost understand it. Like, that's a compromising position. He's young, he's taking over. I think it's at the end of this story when we kind of lose our respect for him, the king, the new king, because he seems to be fickle. He seems to go back and forth, right? He seems to not know his own mind, or he seems to be conflicted about duty and honor versus his own interests. And we know at the end of the story, he picks his own interests and he breaks the king's words and his new fiance's probably heart. He chooses really himself over his promise. And I think that's true for a lot of us. So I'm trying to kind of explain on the second page, kind of the textual references and what's going on in the story. So maybe read through that. That will kind of maybe help you explain and transition the ideas. I gave you the quotes. I gave you the textual references. Your job is to seamlessly explain when a promise was made, when it was broken, when in the story, and why it's concerning. Does that make sense, everybody? Okay, so please read this story. It's a good one. I think you'll like it. Not to mention the fact when you read the story, there's subtle things and connections that you make as a reader that will help you kind of explain everything. Okay, this concludes week 2 in September, the lesson from the Grimm's brothers, The 12 Huntsmen. Have a great day.